As we all know, druids are pretty shifty characters.
After all, they're one of the only classes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that requires referencing a whole other sourcebook to understand one of their core class features, and that's Wildshape, and you're going to need the monster manual for this one. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including guides for players and advice for dungeon masters.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today we are doing our in-depth guide to the Druid's Wildshape forms in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We're going to be going through the monster manual and discussing our top recommendations for the various beasts and other creatures that your druid can shift into using Wildshape.
With so many beasts to choose from, it can be a little tough to know what to turn into when. So we're going to highlight what we think the best options are both for in-combat and exploration.
And of course, in this guide, we are going to touch on the forms that are available to every single druid, regardless of your subclass, but we are really going to spend a little bit more time on the various forms that are available to Circle of the Moon druids, because the list is much longer and that class feature is a bigger part of the Moon druids repertoire.
So, let's get shifting. To kick things off, let's discuss how Wildshape works.
Starting at 2nd level, a druid can use their action to magically assume the form of a beast that they have seen before. They can use this ability twice and regain all these uses when they finish a short or long rest.
Your druid level determines the CR rating of the beasts that you can turn into, and there's a table for this in the player's handbook in the druid section.
Additionally, you're not able to transform into a beast that has a swimming speed until your druid gets to level 4, and you can't transform into a beast that has a flying speed until your druid reaches level 8. This is a restriction applied regardless of whether or not you are a Circle of the Moon druid, for a Circle of the Moon druid is able to increase the challenge rating of the creatures that they're able to become, starting at CR1 right away when they gain the class feature, CR2 at level 6, and then 1/3 of their druid level thereafter.
You can also stay in your beast form for a number of hours equal to half of your druid level.
You revert back to your original form as well if you dismiss the form as an action, or if you are reduced to 0 hit points in the form of a beast, you are forcibly returned to your natural form, and any damage left over carries over into your real form.
When you are in beast form, you retain your alignment, personality traits, and your intelligence, wisdom, and charisma scores.
You also maintain your own saving throw and skill proficiencies, in addition to gaining those of the target form that you assume. If your natural bonus in any of those skills or saving throws is higher than those of the beast that you're transforming into, you can use yours instead of those of the beast. But otherwise, your statistics are completely replaced with those of the form that you assume. So that means that you actually need to reference the creature stat block in the monster manual and put your character sheet aside except for these exceptions.
When you assume the beast form, you also take on the hit points and hit dice of that form. As well, your languages and ability to use your hands is limited by the form that you take.
So this means that if you do transform into a beast that has a language or some sort of creature that is able to speak, your druid can still speak while they're wild-shaped. But if you become something like a bird or a wolf that doesn't have the same ability to form words that a human does, your ability to speak is similarly restricted. You also retain any other class features and can use them as long as they're not based on casting spells. As well, if you have any racial traits that would work with your new form, you can use those. This is a little bit subjective, and so it's always worth discussing with your dungeon master what is and is not allowed. The question often comes up, can a dragonborn druid who wild shapes still use their breath weapon? In my books, no, but I've heard contradictory rulings to either case, so I'm going to leave that one up to the DM.
When you assume your beast form, you get to choose regarding your equipment whether it falls to the side and is just in a pile next to you, or if it's absorbed into the beast form itself, meaning that when you turn back out of the beast form, you still have all your equipment with you.
Or the equipment could be worn and used by the form, again, if the form can use that in some way. It seems pretty reasonable to say that your beast form could perhaps still wear a necklace that you might have, or keep a ring depending on if it has fingers or appendages that could wear those. The rules for Wildshape are pretty specific, and there are several exceptions. But the basic rule of thumb to remember is that you keep your brains, you can't cast spells, and you just want to grab the stat block of whatever it is that you're transforming into and use that while you're transformed, unless there's a skill or saving throw on your own character sheet that's higher.
There seems to be a lot of common beast forms that people choose, and having these stat blocks ready at hand to just whip out whenever you decide I'm going to turn into this sort of creature. You get to know the creatures a little bit over time, but you definitely want those stat blocks in front of you. Once you've kind of grasped the basic rules of transforming into your wild shape, it can be a really transformative experience.
In creating your druid, Xanathar's Guide to Everything has a couple useful tables that describe the creatures that are native to different environments where your druid might have grown up. And I recommend using these tables as a baseline to determine what is a reasonable expectation for your druid to have seen or not seen. If you do have a particular form in mind that you want to transform into, you should probably discuss that with your dungeon master in advance, particularly for the beasts that have been added in modules like Tomb of Annihilation and Storm King's Thunder, and books outside the monster manual, because these creatures might not be something that your character might just have seen if they haven't been on those adventures.
On the other side of that, as a DM, I like to be pretty lenient with low-level beasts. If my druid says, yeah, I want to turn into a squirrel or a badger or a bat or anything of that nature, I tend to just go ahead and say, you probably have seen this at some point in your adventuring.
There's a lot of very common and small creatures that don't have a stat block to represent them. In fact, there is no stat block for a squirrel or a rabbit. Sometimes it is worth improvising a little bit with your dungeon master and finding the closest equivalent for forms that come up spontaneously. Every druid does have a bunch of challenge rating 0 and 1/4 forms that they can transform into right away as soon as they gain the wild shape feature. And the reason why these small forms are very, very interesting is because they make for great nondescript scouts for a druid to go out and explore the wilds in a pretty nondescript way.
Things like the badger, the scorpion, the spider, the bat, the rat, the cat, these are all things that can really fit in the right environment and really give your druid some somewhat camouflage in a way, because if you see a spider in an underground cavern, you're not really going to pay much attention to it.
Yeah, turning into a spider or a rat and climbing down a little hole might be an excellent way to escape. Because your equipment merges into your form, I've seen this popular tactic of a druid putting their party members in a bag of holding, transforming into a spider, sneaking into a castle, untransforming, and then dumping all the party members out of the bag of holding.
They would have to hold their breath in the bag of holding.
They would, but it could work.
So beyond the tiny creatures, you can also transform into things like boars, camels, horses, wolves, and various other forms that can actually be pretty useful for mobility or just tactical, interesting options.
If you're looking for a simple and effective combat form, something like the wolf, with its 11 hit points and its pack tactics and attack that pulls targets prone, is a great little form for even a druid that is focused more on their spellcasting side to assume at this low level of play.
It also can be really helpful to keep in mind that you assume the hit points of the creature, which then after it is reduced to 0, you revert back to your normal form. This means that at level 2, transforming into a wolf gives you 11 extra hit points. So if you're getting pummeled in combat, sometimes wild shaping can be that extra buffer you need to withstand that combat. Once you hit Druid level 4, the CR rating of the creatures that you can wild shape into becomes 1/2, and you can also take on forms that have a swim speed.
This means that you can assume forms like the Black Bear, which has a multi-attack to make 2 attacks and a good 19 hit points, which again is a pretty big boost for a 4th level character. But you now also have access to creatures like the Giant Frog and Constrictor Snakes, which can swim, get underwater, and effectively fight in aquatic environments.
This means that once you hit level 4, if you need to do any sort of underwater combat or exploration, the druid becomes one of the primary people to do that.
In many aquatic environments, navigating as a reef shark or a crocodile is pretty useful.
Yeah, you can also become the giant crab, which gives you some pinchers to move around. I think any swamp environment, not even underwater, but just the crocodile is very versatile for land and water. So if you're trudging through a swamp, wild shaping into a crocodile, it's going to give you a pretty good advantage.
Now, once you get to level 8 as a druid, you can assume forms up to challenge rating 1, as well as forms that have flying speeds. This overlaps with the forms that the Circle of the Moon druid can start to assume right from 2nd level. But the Circle of the Moon druid still is not able to assume CR1 and lower forms that have flying speeds. So we're going to skip ahead now to the Moon druid, talk about these forms, and then come back in when both the Moon druids and regular druids are able to assume flying forms together, because actually they overlap completely.
So some of the benefits of the Circle of the Moon is that from their circle abilities, they actually get to wild shape as a bonus action instead of using their full action. And the CR rating of the creatures that they can transform into goes up quite a bit.
This means that a druid with the Circle of the Moon can transform into challenge rating 1 creatures right away at 2nd level. They then gain the ability to assume forms up to CR2 starting at level 6, CR3 at level 9, CR4 at level 12, CR5 at 15th level, and CR6 at 18th level. Of course, as the challenge ratings rise, your pool really dramatically drops off, but we're going to talk about what is available to the Circle of the Moon druids at each of these key breakpoints.
So at level 2, you immediately get to assume the form of a CR1 creature. So let's talk about some of our favorite CR1 creatures that we might wild shape into.
So I think the standouts at this level are bears and wolves.
I think that the dire wolf is one of the main ones that stands out. It's CR1, but it's much more powerful than the average wolf.
Yeah, it has 37 hit points. It still has pack tactics, and it has a pretty hard-hitting bite attack that has a chance to knock the target prone.
Also, the dire wolf is really potent with its keen hearing and smell. So if you need to track an enemy or something like that, turn into a dire wolf, and now you're a tracking dog.
I'm also a really big fan of the brown bear. Its AC and hit points are a little bit lower than the dire wolf, but it gets multi-attack, so it gets to attack twice, both with its bite and its claws. So it can deal quite a little bit more damage than the dire wolf.
Both of these forms make really excellent frontline fighters.
Outside of these two forms, I also think the giant spider is amazing.
So I'm actually DMing Out of the Abyss right now, and our druid is constantly turning into a giant spider, because not only does that allow her to blend in everywhere she goes, but also climbing walls and basically being able to hide everywhere. It's really an awesome form.
So what makes the giant spider really special is that more than just having a climb speed, it can climb on vertical surfaces and even upside down because of the spider climb feature. But it also is one of the wild shape forms that has a ranged attack. It's not one that deals damage, but it restrains creatures, which makes it awesome crowd control capability.
There was actually a great moment in my campaign where one of the allies was down. And I allowed this at the table where they used the ranged attack to attach to it, and I let them drag the ally away on web.
I remember when one of our druids transformed into a giant spider so they could ferry explosives and web them underneath a bridge that the party needed to destroy in secret. So they were carrying the bombs like eggs, webbing them in place, and once they were all rigged up, they were able to then blow up the bridge.
Once again, that's stretching the ability a little bit, but I just think it's such a cool tactical use, and I love rewarding creativity.
Yeah.
And once they hit level 4, that CR1 creature roster opens up to things like the giant toad and the giant octopus, which not only have some decent attacks, but they also have some really interesting, unique abilities.
Yeah, both the giant toad and the giant octopus have melee attacks that restrain creatures, and the giant octopus's 15-foot reach gives it the ability to then hold those creatures at bay.
I also think it's hilarious that the giant toad has an ability called swallow, so it can actually grab an enemy with its tongue, pull it in, and then try to swallow it.
That does end up with the awful scenario of what happens if you swallow a creature and then your druid has to transform back into their natural form while the swallowed creature is still alive. I would probably rule as a DM that is the process of reverting back to your natural form. You regurgitate that creature, But if they're dead in your gullet, I guess you got a free meal.
So when our Moon Druid reaches level 6, they can now assume the form of a CR2 beast.
The other cool thing that all Moon Druids get at this level is the Primal Strike ability. So now all of your attacks as a Druid in Wildshape count as magical for the purposes of bypassing damage resistances.
Which is very useful. There's a lot of monsters out there that have damage resistance except to magical weapons. And the limitation of beasts not having magical claws is just nixed by this ability.
Yeah, and at CR2, I think there are two standout forms that I would assume. The giant constrictor snake and the giant elk.
The giant constrictor snake I've seen used so many times with its ability to grapple creatures and just undo combats by taking the biggest hitter and wrapping themselves around them and taking them out of that combat. And everybody else now has advantage, and it just really changes the battlefield. Constrictor snakes are great.
On the other hand, the giant elk is just a great damage dealer. Its hoof attack does 4d8 plus its strength modifier damage, and its ram attack gets an extra 2d6 damage on top of its base 2d6 when you move at least 10 feet. So it really can hammer in some great melee attacks, whether it's close up or charging in from a distance. Two things that you might have missed with both of these forms is that the giant elk has a language called giant elk. It understands common but can't speak it. And the giant constrictor snake has blind sight. So they bring some really other interesting utilities to the table as well. And on top of that, both of them are huge creatures, which means that you take up a big presence on the battlefield, and that alone can be a huge advantage.
With the constrictor snake, you get over 60 additional hit points, and then with the elk, you get 40. These are not small numbers to add to your hit point maximum.
No, the pools are really, really large, and in many cases, at level 6 with these CR2 beasts, these forms will have more hit points than many characters at this level will have.
So once any of our druids reach level 8, we now have access to flying speeds, and there's some really cool creature options in here too.
However, in the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there are no flying beasts with a challenge rating higher than 1. This means that there is no flying form the Moon Druid can assume that is not available to a conventional Druid. The highest creatures being the giant vulture and the giant eagle. So those are really your only options for the top end flying creatures, although there's a huge range of smaller flying creatures that you can become, like owls and hawks. If you're looking for the most robust one, these are going to be your two options.
Both the giant eagle and the giant vulture have the ability to have some party members on its back for transportation purposes. You need to get over a long distance in a short amount of time, just fly them all there.
Yeah, you've got a couple hours of flight right off the bat. Both the giant eagle and the giant vulture are decent combatants as well, although the giant vulture does have pack tactics, which is pretty nasty.
Although it does have lower hit points than the giant eagle.
Yeah, and a lower AC as well, so it's a little bit more vulnerable for the trade-off of that extra offensive power from pack tactics. It is worth mentioning that Tomb of Annihilation did add a dinosaur form that flies, that's challenge rating 2. It's a huge creature as well, and I can't for the life of me pronounce it. It's that strange one that starts with a Q. Maybe we'll put the word up on screen. I can't pronounce this, and I'm not even going to try.
Is it the one that Kyle?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he says a word at the table, and I'm just that's the big bird dinosaur.
And it has a dive attack.
Yeah.
And it does a lot of damage. So a Moon Druid can transform into that one.
If they've seen it before.
Your
world does need to have dinosaurs in it.
So if you're playing Tomb of Annihilation or there's dinosaurs in your campaign world, you do have that as an option for you. But that's the top end for flying creatures. Now, at level 9, your Druid can start assuming forms of challenge rating 3 or higher. And this is where the monster manual really starts falling short, and there are not a lot of options to choose from.
So there are only 3 options for challenge rating 3 beasts that you can transform into. The Ankylosaurus, the killer whale, and the giant scorpion.
Of these, the giant scorpion is just amazing and is the best option in combat.
It has 2 pinchers that can actually grapple enemies, and then as well as its sting attack, which can do poison.
Yes, it's got a pretty low attack bonus, but it has a really good AC and good defenses, and it's a great go-to form at this level of play. It's awesome.
It actually has a lot of battlefield control from what I've seen, and it's just it's a really useful creature to have in your pocket for wild shape options.
That poisonous stinger does so much damage. It also has blind sight.
Of course it does.
Yeah,
So
60-foot blind sight.
It can see in the dark, it can cause poison, it can grapple enemies.
It's great. It's a wonderful form, especially appropriate for this higher level of play. I think that the other 2 forms, the Ankylosaurus, doesn't really match up against it, and the killer whale, I mean, if you're going to go underwater, why not be a whale?
But in almost, I'd say there's almost a 90% chance that the killer whale is not a go-to option.
No, except in that underwater pirate campaign.
Once you hit level 12 as a moon druid, you can change into a CR4 creature, which really gives you one option.
Yeah, the only CR4 beast in the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is the elephant, which is decent. It has 76 hit points and the trampling charge, which lets it make 2 attacks if it knocks somebody prone.
Also, it is pretty cool to ride an elephant into battle, so I just picture the barbarian riding on the elephant's back.
Yeah.
It can be pretty cool. There was another option added in, though. The Stegosaurus was added in
Volo's Guide to Monsters.
Volo's Guide to Monsters.
So you do have 2 options. Both of them are kind of, I don't know. I think I might still be tempted to turn into a scorpion.
Yeah, unless I really want the idea of an elephant charging into battle, which, was used in old school warfare from time to time. Mm-hmm. At least in all the medieval things that I've seen, such as Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. I want those elephants.
Although it does pick up a little bit once we get to level 15 with challenge rating 5 creatures. But again, there's only 3 options in the core rules. The giant crocodile, the triceratops, and the giant shark.
Interesting. I would say that the giant crocodile is a pretty useful
It's
option.
amazing. It's great. It does tons of damage. It has a really high attack bonus. The fact that the tail slap knocks someone prone and the bite restrains them and grabs them. The giant crocodile does a lot of damage. It's a beast.
Fought a fair amount of giant crocodiles in my day, and they always mess me up so much more. When you hear crocodile compared to the other monsters you face in D&D, I'm always like, this won't be a problem, and it's always a problem.
The giant crocodile has 85 hit points, which at level 15 is a nice buffer zone, but not quite the dramatic difference it was at earlier levels of play.
No, but it's still, I think when you look at adding to your hit points, even in a game where you add 10 to your HP is pretty decent. So turning into a creature that has 85 hit points, and if you get reduced to 0, you just turn back into your normal form at the amount of hit points you had, still means that you have more hit points than everybody else at the table.
Yeah, I just think that it's pretty easy to get wrecked as a giant crocodile at level 15 play, because now you're going to be facing giants and creatures that have really high attack bonuses, and that 14 AC is not going to do you any favors at this level.
No, they're easy to hit.
Yeah. And it really doesn't pick up any more once you get to level 18, because again, there's only one form here. The mammoth.
And the mammoth is really, really cool, but once again, the Druid Wildshape kind of does this thing where at first it's amazing, and then it kind of just
it plateaus
out. Yeah,
it plateaus pretty early, at around level 10, and that's actually where an important feature for the Moon Druid does come into play. After level 10, I think when you get Elemental Wildshape, turning into a beast is nice, but when you want something to take into battle, you're probably going to go with the Elemental Wildshape.
Yeah, once you do get that elemental ability, there's almost no reason not to bring an elemental in if you're planning combat wild shapes. The beasts become very useful for exploration and stealth and things like that, like turning into small creatures to sneak in and out of places, or being able to turn into a bird to fly over a castle to scout it out. These are always going to be useful tactical options for a druid. But then if you're going to just wreck things in battle, You want to turn into an elemental.
While the elemental wild shape that the Moon Druids get at level 10 does require them to use both of their uses of wild shape to transform into, the elementals are just way more effective than anything else that the Druids get access to. The elementals are all challenge rating 5. You are restricted to the earth, water, fire, or air elemental. It's very specific. It's not just any elemental creature. It's just one of the 4 classic elemental creatures. And all of them are really good, though some are a little bit better than others.
I've always been a fire elemental kind of guy.
The fire elemental does so much damage.
Anything that can do fire damage was always intriguing to me. It's why my first character was a wizard and I just spammed fireball.
The secret to being successful as a fire elemental is the fire elemental can enter other creatures' spaces and stop there, and when it does so, it lights them on fire. So as a fire elemental, part of what you're going to do in battle will just be run around and set all your enemies on fire, and then use the fire elemental's touch attacks. So you really want to leverage the fact that you're going to be lighting it all up as a fire elemental, and that'll get you a lot of damage on the field.
The other one that speaks to me is the water elemental, because I love this idea of being able to move into an enemy space and then drown them. Like, you just basically engulf them in water and they are restrained inside of your form and they cannot breathe.
A creature that's suffocating drops to 0 hit points once they pass the threshold of how long they can hold their breath. And if you suddenly rush onto somebody and they don't have the opportunity to hold their breath, they could go down really, really quickly.
And it's a strength saving throw, so if you have an enemy that relies more on dexterity or is a spellcaster and you engulf them in a water elemental, it's going to be rough for them.
So the thing that we also have to acknowledge is that the air elemental flies.
Yes.
And also does a similar whirlwind ability that sends people flying. So it's great for having that air superiority or tossing people off cliffs, or perhaps even just picking people up and dropping them.
And what about the earth elemental?
So the earth elemental has the highest AC and the most hit points of them all, and it does burrow, but I think it's the one that excites me the least. All the elemental forms are really, really robust. All of them have more than 90 hit points, and they all have resistance to damage from non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing weapons.
Not only that, but most of them have a damage immunity relating to the type of elemental you change into. So if you're fighting in a volcano and there's lava pits everywhere, you can change into a fire elemental and just go into the lava without taking additional fire damage.
Many of the elementals are also immune to really nasty conditions like exhaustion, poison, paralysis, and petrification. So it does give your druid this really nice bit of resilience and robustness on the battlefield, particularly if you're trying to keep a concentration spell in effect or worried about creatures that might paralyze or poison you. Transforming into an elemental just gives you immunity to all of these things and the ability to take a ton of damage. All the elemental forms have more hit points and more resilience overall than I think any other beast form. I couldn't find, until you got to the mammoth, a beast that had over 100 hit points.
Yeah. And I think this is why the Moon Druid, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at Wildshape, and that's kind of your bread and butter for your Druid, and that's what you love most about it, the Moon Druid really gives you some amazing options, including the ability to turn into these elementals. And I think at the end of the day, the most fun that you can have with Wildshape is just thinking outside of the box. When I imagine a Druid and I imagine Wildshape, I think of it like a Swiss Army knife of all of the possibilities for almost any situation you get yourself into. Chances are there's a beast you can change into that would benefit the situation.
A key thing to remember as a druid with Wildshape is that you can't cast your spells once you've Wildshaped. For Moon Druids, this is important because you can Wildshape as a bonus action. So before you jump right into the mind or body of a wolf or a bear or an elemental, be sure to spend that first action to cast a critical concentration-based spell. Because even though you are no longer able to cast spells, you are still able to concentrate on one of the spells or effects that you currently have. And if that spell grants you an additional action, or there's ways that you can control that spell, you can still control it while you're Wildshaped. So for instance, a druid could cast Flaming Sphere. use that flaming sphere and move it around and use it to cause extra damage and still benefit from their wild shape form. You could be calling down bolts of lightning with Call Lightning while you are in the form of a scorpion. Or keeping the pressure up with your wall of fire while you're transformed into a fire elemental. These are great 1-2 punch combinations, and so thinking about how to match your wild shape form to the spell that you're going to be concentrating on is really an excellent cornerstone strategy for playing a druid effectively.
So this has been a look at the wild shape class ability of the Druid in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us your favorite stories about wild shaping in your games in the comments below.
If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. You can find out how by following the links in the description below.
You can also check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes in a playlist right up over here.
And we've got way more in-depth guides to the classes and special abilities in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.